Okay, so like Monty said, I'm going to be talking a little bit today about ethons and what they are and why you should care about them. My name is Erica Voss. I work at Janssen. And so if you're familiar with Patrick Ryan, who kind of has organized and runs a lot of Odyssey, I've been reporting to him for the past 10 years or so. I'm also a student of Peter. I've probably been a student for too long, working on finishing this year. And so by being a PhD student at Erasmus, I've done some work with EHDEN over the past couple of years through my involvement with Peter. Okay, so I've broken up my presentation today into three parts. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I'm here because I know I haven't met all of you on the call. And so I'll give you a little bit of reasons why I'm here today. But before I can actually talk about an ethon, I think I want to give an example of network-based research. I think that makes it tangible, what I'm going to talk about in terms of an ethon. And then I'll explain like what we do and why it's been valuable, particularly in EHDEN, to do these ethon events. Okay, so why should you listen to me for like the next 20 to 30 minutes? So, So, like I said, I am a student of Peters, and when COVID started about 2 years ago, Eden put forth a grant, and this was called the COVID-19 Data Partner Call. And the idea was we wanted to ensure that we had data assets within Eden that contained information about COVID. And so part of this grant was that, data partners had to say how many COVID patients they had at the time in their application. And so we wanted to ensure that we had pieces of information. So if we needed to do observational research on COVID, we were going to have data partners that had access to that. And at the time, this was a pretty good call, and we had 75 applicants, and were awarded 25 grants. And I can see some of you on the call today that were part of this, and your names are on the screen. And these were the data partners that were awarded the grant, and they were from many different countries, particularly Spain, the UK, and Italy. So there have been many grants through Eden, but the COVID-19 grant was a little bit different than other grants in that we assigned each data partner that was awarded a grant an Eden task force. And that Eden task force were individuals who have experience doing CDMs, working with the vocabulary. And so the idea was if we paired up data partners with people who have experience or have lots of experience doing the mappings, that the mappings should go a little faster and that we should be able to get to a CDM quicker than like the traditional route that a lot of Eden data partners have gone down, where it's like the data partner working with an SME. Now, during this this call for data, we went through the process very similarly to how I hope everybody on the call is going through this process, where you have your data sets. We would summarize the source data using White Rabbit. The Eden Task Force would be critical in helping the ETL design. So we would help make decisions about what are the best ways to do the design. We also had members on the task force that were experts in the vocabulary, so they could help with that vocabulary mapping process and how to think through it. Ultimately, each data partner needed to implement their ETL on their own, but we were there to answer questions about how we've implemented some of our own ETLs. And then I definitely think the task force was critical in helping perform quality assessment. So as data partners ran Achilles and DQD, we were able to answer questions about, what we were seeing and what should be tackled immediately and maybe what could wait till later. Ultimately, all the data partners, got to a CDM, just like everybody here on the call who is working to convert their data. And so obviously I was part of one of the Eden task force. I actually worked with all 25 different data partners. So I was very involved with this grant and this call for data. Okay, so that's why I'm here today. And I want to talk about ethons, but I think in order to do that, I need to give an example of network-based research. And so all of you are standardizing your data and standardizing your terminology in order to facilitate network-based research, which can operate in a standardized way. And I think thinking about ethons are a little bit easier if we have a tangible example. So I'm going to walk through um, a study. And I'm actually going to walk through two different things. First, I'm going to start with a study that has already had a protocol developed, code that was developed, code that was shared to a network. The results for the network data partners that participated were shared back, and a paper has already been written. So this first thing that I'm going to go through has already lived a full life cycle of network-based research. And then I'm going to pivot and talk about a study that's very similar, but we've used in the ethon setting. And to kind of just give you the high level on an ethon is an event that we hold with EHDEN Data Partners where we help them execute a study on their CDM. And the idea is that we've spent a lot of time helping you prepare your CDMs, and now we want to help you think about how do I generate evidence on the CDM. So that's kind of the high level. I'm going to start by talking about this paper or this project that's already been worked through to completion. So you can go out to BMJ and actually pull this paper down now. And this was what we were looking at is characterizing background incidence rates of adverse events of special interest that were associated to the COVID-19 vaccines. And specifically, what we were doing here is we were looking to understand the background rates in the general population of these adverse events of special interest. So, like I said, there is a code set that was developed, sent out to data partners, executed, and we've already shared the results here. So you've probably, I'm hoping a lot of you have actually heard the term AESIs, but for those who have not, AESIs are adverse events of special interest. And particularly when it comes to thinking about the vaccines, there are adverse events that we typically think about when vaccines hit the market, things like anaphylaxis and different thrombotic events. And when we're doing research, it, in planning and preparing for vaccines to hit the market, we need to understand two different things in order to do that safety evaluation. First, we need to understand the background rate of these adverse events in a general population. So we have to understand how often does anaphylaxis happen in a general population in the absence of the vaccination. And then once the vaccine hits the market, we can then start to see what's the observed rate. How often are these events happening post vaccination? And then we can make a comparison. Is this more than what was happening typically, or is this less than what was happening typically? Now, historically, if we were to do this research, background rates typically would be coming from literature. So, an epidemiologist would go out, do a literature review, and hopefully pull out representative incidence rates to understand how often adverse events were occurring in the general population. Um, and maybe if you're lucky, somebody would perform a real world study. But usually, what this was looking at is single incidence rates that were produced maybe in an individual population. So, for example, maybe I have a background rate of anaphylaxis in an Italian population, but I don't know, does that actually extrapolate to the US or to the Netherlands? We didn't always have that flexibility. So that's where we would get background rates, literature, and maybe if you're lucky, a real world database study. And then the observed rates, so once we have the vaccine on the market, those were typically we get from self-reported data. So I'm from the US and I'm more used to what's going on here with the FDA. So within the FDA, if somebody is exposed to a vaccine and experiences an adverse event, a physician can report it to the government, or even the patient can report it to the government, and that is self-reported data. The self-reported data is then used by organizations like Janssen to understand, do we see a signal, and is there something that we should be concerned about? Now, in preparation for the vaccines hitting the market, Odyssey thought, hey, we have access to a lot of data. We could actually produce some of these background rates and use a lot of different data sources, and start to understand what are we actually seeing in terms of these AESIs. So Odyssey designed a study, and it looked at 15 different adverse events. It was able to run it across 13 different data sources, and it ran it across and that was representative of 8 different countries. And because we were designing the study, we were also able to do things like do age, sex stratification. So a study was designed, and the goal was to produce these background incidence rates from prior to COVID becoming a reality, to see how often were these things happening even before COVID, and definitely before the vaccines. We planned to stratify by age, sex, and database, and then ultimately do a pooled incidence rates using random effects meta-analysis. Here are the 13 different databases that contributed to the study, and I will say that 2 of them um, are EHDEN Data Partners, and technically you could say 3 of them are EHDEN Data Partners. So even in this early study, we had EHDEN participating. We definitely had a good sampling of different countries and different populations to understand what are these background rates. Now, I keep talking about these 15 adverse events of special interest. Where did they come from? So early on in the pandemic, as the FDA was preparing to study adverse events in the vaccines, essentially the FDA said, okay, these are the things we typically think about when vaccines hit the market. So things like I said, anaphylaxis, appendicitis, narcolepsy, a lot of thrombotic events like deep vein thrombosis, hemorrhagic stroke, pulmonary embolism. And so the FDA asserted these are things we know we want to monitor now. And so Odyssey said, okay, we got the list. We're going to think about how we're going to find these conditions in data, and implement them, assuming that we're going to be running our study on the OMOP common data model using the OMOP vocabulary. So a lot of work went into defining how do we think about these conditions. The study was run, and across all the different databases, there were 126 million people or patient lives, and that represented 227 million person years of follow-up. So very large in terms of the amount of data that was contributing. And so what did we do? What did we produce from this? So we produced incidence rates, and we were able to produce these plots where if we look at disseminated intravascular coagulation here, because we did the gender age stratification, we were able to show across the ages, across the genders, what were the different incidence rates by database. So the different colors within this plot each represent a database. So here I see this dark blue. This is a Japanese data set versus this kind of dark pink color, which is a German data set from IQVIA. And just plotting the incidence rates, we did notice some trends. So, for example, with some of the thrombotic events, we noticed that in the general population, when we calculated these incidence rates, that there was a clear increase in frequency with age across all the databases. So you can see here in non-hemorrhagic stroke that the incidence rates for younger populations are consistently lower than the incidence rates for older populations. And we saw this trend pretty consistently for some of these thrombotic events. We saw the opposite trend to be true in different conditions. So things like appendicitis and anaphylaxis seem to be more common in younger patients versus older patients. And in some cases, it really didn't see a trend at all, like myocarditis and pericarditis. It kind of is consistent over the different age groups. We also learned that there's a lot of heterogeneity between databases. So, again, looking at disseminated intravascular coagulation, if I'm just looking at the age 65 to 74 females, I can see there's a lot of variety of what's going on here in terms of the incidence rates. So Japan is the top here, and so that incidence rate is much higher than what we were seeing from IQVIA Germany. And so that gets you to start to think that if I only looked at one database, where would I have been on this spectrum of incidence rates? So, per the protocol, we did want to produce these kind of pooled meta-analysis, but definitely because we were seeing such variability across age and gender, we produced that meta-analysis, these pooled incidence rates by gender and age group. And in the paper from Xintong, she did a really nice job. Kind of displaying this information. So she's got all the 15 ASIs, she's got the gender breakout, she's got the ages across the top. What she did is she used this classification that says, given an incidence rate, how would I classify it? Would I classify it as being very rare, rare, uncommon, or common? And what you can actually see is like the kind of that classification changes depending on your age. So kind of in general, we're seeing that like events become more common in the older population versus the younger population. This is a really nice way to kind of think about, the terms of like just in a general population, how often are these things happening? So, for example, non-hemorrhagic stroke is very rare in young subjects and becomes common in 85 or plus. And we even see kind of the gender playing a role. So here's acute myocardial infarction. If I look here, subjects move from being having the acute myocardial infarction being rare to uncommon earlier in males. So it happens 35 to 54-year-olds in males, where in females it remains rare. So not only are we seeing kind of like this age difference, but we're also seeing a little bit of the gender differences as well. So what we took away from the study is that like age effect is strong, so you should be thinking about stratifying by age. We definitely saw database heterogeneity, and so that that gets you starting to think about like if I see these individual estimates, particularly from like individual data sets, these might should be interpreted with some caution because you don't have a full kind of understanding of what's might be going on. Okay, so I walk through that study because it's something that has fully been executed. And now I'm going to talk about a study that's actually we used, and it's a real life study, but we did it for one of our ethons. So basically the same idea of the study I just walked through. We are also performing adverse events of special interest in COVID-19 population. So instead of the general population, we're going to look at those same adverse events of special interest in COVID-19 subjects. And the idea, particularly, when we're thinking about safety of vaccines, it provides a nice counterfactual argument of what's going on, and when you're comparing what would happen, how often these adverse events are happening in COVID subjects versus how often they're having post-vaccination. So we are actively working on this now and actually just starting to write the publication. So just like with the prior work, we publicly made available a protocol. The code is publicly available, and many data partners within EHDEN have participated. So just very quickly, the target cohorts, instead of being a general population, are COVID-19. Our outcomes are those same 15 AESIs. The only difference that since Xintong started her work, thrombosis and thrombocytopenia has become a thing. So we've added that as well to our 15 adverse events. We're still going to stratify by age and sex. We have 7 different times at risk that go from 0 days to 365 days. And we're going to report the same types of counts, incidence rates, and incidence proportions. So technically, our data collection is closed. We sent out an invite to 41 different data partners. 13 chose to not participate for various reasons. We have one data partner who's still working on producing the results, and we have 27 data partners that have participated in this study. So it's actually the official largest study that's been done on the OMOP Common Data Model at this point. And I'm very proud that 12 of those data partners are EHDEN Data Partners. And a lot of the data partners that participated had participated on past ethons. And so I think the ethon kind of primed them for participation. Across those 27 different data partners, it's representative of 12 different countries. So this is a step larger than the previous paper that I talked about. Okay, so I've essentially given you a ton of background information to kind of get to the point of this presentation. What is an ethon? But I really think giving you an example study kind of makes this part a little bit more tangible when we're talking about ethons. So you're all part of EHDEN, so you've probably heard Peter present this slide where he talks about EHDEN's vision and mission. And the thing that he always talks about when he presents this slide is he always says, the second E represents evidence. And so the whole reason we're here is not to produce a whole bunch of CDMs and stand up a bunch of servers. The whole reason we're here is to produce evidence. And so the common data model is just kind of on the path to producing evidence. And after the COVID-19 call started to kind of slow down, in EHDEN, what we started to think about is that these calls for data are very centered on helping data partners get from this your raw data into the common data model. And then at least I felt like with the COVID call, once you were kind of done with your CDM, it was like, okay, good job, see you later. I hope you figure out producing evidence. And what we thought was, hey, why don't we actually kind of bridge that gap? Why don't we hold these EHDEN evidence-a-thons or ethons to provide examples of how you run network-based research? And at least in my experience with the COVID call, there was definitely a lot of variety in the experience with performing studies on their own data. So there was everything from data partners that were really already doing studies, already producing evidence on the raw data, and now they were just kind of flipping the mindset of how do I do it in a network-based approach, all the way to data partners who just never done anything with their data. And so just producing evidence on their data, regardless of it being in the raw format of the CDM, is just a completely new concept. And so the whole idea of the evidence-a-thon is let's provide data partners an example study that's already thought out, the protocol already exists, the code already exists. Essentially what you're doing is running the study and then thinking about how do I interpret the results. The way we structure these ethons is at least what we've been doing for the past 2 ethons is when data partners have completed their CDM, they're sent an invite and said, hey, would you like to participate in the ethon about a month? We've invited people. Not everybody is always able to attend the ethons, but what we've been saying is we are trying to do them on a regular cadence. So if you don't participate now, there's future opportunities to participate. And then at that point, we give homework assignments. So we say, okay, here is an actual real life study. You need to go run it and you need to submit the results. And the way that we provide the study to data partners is no different than what I would provide to somebody else who is already in the Odyssey community and already running studies. So the homework is essentially you're going to participate in the study. The homework's also making sure you get the necessary governance and ethics reviews. So that usually has taken place over a month. And then if you're able to complete running the study and submitting results, then you participate in the 2-a-day event. And the 2-a-day event allows data partners to connect. So we've had about 5 data partners on the call at a time. And so people are able to kind of learn about who are different data partners in the community. And so that's very nice. And then during the day, we essentially are learning how to review the results and practicing review the results. So we would spend part of our time reviewing a clinical concept, and then we would say, okay, now that you understand the clinical concept, let's think about how to interpret that evidence for the clinical concept in the evidence that you produced, in the data that you produced. And then we would do breakout sessions where data partners will go off on their own and think about, can I do this on my own? And so we did that several times over the course of a couple of days, and it allowed people, allowed data partners to kind of practice what actually happens in real network-based research. So it just kind of allows